to our parable series. I'm Cynthia Johnson, and this is Tommy Perkins, and we both work in children's ministry.
It's fantastic to be here and to be a part of this series. And today we are discussing the parable of the workers who are paid equal, or the parable of the vineyard workers from the book of Matthew, chapter 20.
And it's interesting because I think this was our first choice, each individually, like separately, because, okay, so what's the phrase we hear most often working with children?
Oh man, it's not fair.
It's not fair.
That's not fair. You're not fair. Oh my gosh, and it bleeds even further past children's ministry into our own homes if you have young children, or if you have any children in your home. And then it seems like it has absolutely exploded within our societies.
Yeah, and I think anybody who has children or is around children is very familiar with this phrase. It's not fair.
So why are we so obsessed with this notion of fairness?
Fairness, it's so ingrained into our society. And it's not part of God's plan.
That's right, and I'm really glad you put it that way, that it's not part of God's plan. Is a lot of times we confuse those two things, and we'll say, hey, well, that wasn't fair that happened to this family, or this wasn't fair that this happened to me, or why isn't it fair that these people have more or less than we do, when God's perfect society is not set up on fairness.
Well, and I think what it comes down to, and we'll get into this in a minute, is that God's not fair.
Right.
He's unbelievably just and gracious, but by human standards, he's not fair.
Right. And so it's that big thing that really comes out in this parable is that justice and grace went out over that. That is God's benevolence right there, is that yes, he is a just God, but he is also a merciful and graceful God.
And we're going to start in Matthew chapter 19, verse 30, which is really the verse right before the title, The Parable of the Workers in the Vineyard.
So Matthew chapter 19, verse 30 says, "But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them 1 denarius for a day, and then sent them into his vineyard. About the 3rd hour he went and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing, and he told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour he went out and found still others standing around, and he asked them, 'Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first.'"
Okay, so right here, let me stop you. You know those workers that had been there for the whole day were excited.
Oh yeah, they had finally got it. They got their day's wages. Their families would eat, or they would find safe, shelter and harbor. They were there, and they had put in the time. But right from the get-go, they see that those who came into the 11th hour, those who had done an eighth of the day's work, got paid before they did.
Yes, got paid before they did. And let's go ahead. I'm going to keep reading from here.
Go right ahead.
"The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'Those who were hired last only worked 1 hour,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them, 'I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?'" And then we get to where we started. "So the last will be first, and the first will be last."
So yeah, in our human nature, our heart screams for that's unfair. I worked longer.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily harder, but I spent more time in the field and more time, in the outdoors. I was there and ready to go first thing in the morning, but
Well, and it's not fair.
sure.
I mean, it wouldn't be fair.
No, it wouldn't be.
But it's it's easy to look at a story like this and think that Jesus is making a commentary about labor laws or minimum wage or equality in business.
So one of the books that we looked into when we were studying and getting ready for this, if you want to tell about this.
Excellent book,
Right.
Parables by John MacArthur.
And so one of my favorite things in studying behind this really hinges on that point and points out that Jesus was not making social commentary.
Right.
Jesus was not talking about labor laws. He was not talking about fair practice in business. Jesus was absolutely showing his followers, this is how God's justice works. This is how God's mercy works. This is how things work in heaven.
The kingdom of heaven is like.
Yes,
That's
exactly
absolutely.
right.
And so I want to get into this whole principle of the first will be last and the last will be first a little bit more. For starters, just the beautiful imagery here and the literature of the Bible. So we have this bookend, if you will. It starts at the very beginning with the first but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. And it ends with the reverse of that. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. So what do you think about that principle in general?
So when I think about that principle in general, it just shows me the absolute reach of God's grace and His willingness to bestow that upon us. The other thing is when the vineyard owner in our own parable goes ahead and says, "Don't I have the right to do with what I want with my own money?"
Right.
So God has all the grace and all the mercy, and He can divvy it up just as He sees fit to divvy it up.
And it's interesting that you use that word, divvy it up, because a lot of times we look at things like this, like a pie that we're going to divide up and you earn a slice of it.
Right.
And that was actually, okay, so we've got another book here. It's, John, by the way, is that really his name?
Oh, yeah, I guess
By
so.
the way, okay.
It is, wow.
John, by the way, wrote this book of of pigs, pearls, and prodigals. And he talked about the contrast between scarcity principle and the principle of abundance. And, God's grace falls under the principle of abundance.
Right.
And there's no limit to it. So it's not a pie that's divvied up or divided up. It's something that is an unlimited, abundant supply. He can give to whomever he wants.
And He can give to whomever He wants. And it is unlimited and abundant. I'm really glad you put it that way. One of the things that we look at, and we as church people fall into this category a lot, we say, well, some of them need more grace than others.
We've been here since early in the morning, out in the heat of the day.
That person over there is going to need a lot more grace. When the fact is no. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are all in the boat needing the exact same amount of grace, which is all of it.
Exactly. And, like if you flip over, okay, so Romans chapter 9, verse 15. Okay, God from Luke, this is quoting back to Moses. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy.
Right. And this is Paul reminding his Roman audience that this followed the very concept put down to us directly by God. And it's like, hey, it is not for your choice. There are so many things that not only do we not understand, that we're incapable of understanding because we cannot fathom everything that is God. One thing that we can do is we can latch on to that grace in full thanks.
Yes.
For it.
And if we look back at that principle of the first will be last and the last will be first, there is just a history of this throughout the Bible, starting with Cain and Abel.
Right. Followed not very long after there by Ishmael and Isaac.
Right. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son. But God's blessing went to Isaac.
Joseph and his brothers.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, hey, don't forget Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau. Solomon and David.
Okay. Yeah. So Saul.
Saul and David. Yes.
Yeah. So Saul and David. Saul's firstborn son was Jonathan. That's who the kingship should have gone to. But instead, it went to
David.
Who was from a lower income family
Right.
and the youngest of what,
family. Yeah.
10 children?
It broke all the mores of how the Jewish family was set up that day.
Exactly.
Which is all the furthermore way to prove that God's rules are not applicable with ours.
Exactly.
Or excuse me, probably better said, our rules are not applicable with the way that the Lord does things. That's why I love how so many, you pointed it out earlier, that so many of these parables begin with the kingdom of heaven is like. Because a lot of times when we study Jesus, we hone in on the human side of him, and we kind of forget to acknowledge the deity side of him while he was here on earth. But he's telling them, he's like, look, I can't possibly in words explain to you what it's going to be like, but I'll give you my best shot.
That's what I was just thinking. The deity side of him that we just really have no concept of. No way to understand without these pictures, these beautiful pictures that he's given us.
So how do we battle this fairness mentality in our lives, in our homes, in our families when we come up on these things? Because yes, some things in life are not fair, right?
Well, many things in life are not fair.
not that that's not fair, but many things in that are. And so is it just enough to just concentrate on the justice, mercy side of it? Because you brought up that God is a just God, and he is. He's a rightfully just God, but not and merciful. He's rightfully just, but also is merciful.
Yes.
Because if we all really wanted fair, then we would have to accept the justice. And to accept the justice would mean we would all be guilty and sentenced to death.
Right. Absolutely. Because we are all guilty. But there's that grace that comes back in. And, by its very definition, it's undeserved.
Yeah.
Or not fair.
Or not fair.
Yeah.
Now, I can also see that, we don't squabble so much at the end, say, oh, well, how come they got more grace than I did, or anything like that. That grace is all reaching.
No, because it's not more grace.
Right, it's not
just
more.
Grace.
It is just grace.
It's just grace.
That is exactly right.
There's other parables and teachings of Jesus that teach us this same principle. So one of them that I particularly like is the prodigal son.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's the same principle. Are there any other teachings that you can think of right now?
And I like the prodigal son one too, because it jumps right into that fairness, because the very first person that had a problem when the prodigal son came back was the older brother.
The older brother, yeah.
He said, hey, look, I've been here the whole time. And the father said, look, everything I own is already yours. But we're rejoicing, for this very lost sheep mentality. I like to think of the thief on the cross.
Okay, yeah.
When we look into this justice and fairness.
And comparing him maybe even to Judas.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Who was by Jesus' side the whole time up until the very end.
Yep. And you flip-flop that with a guy who had lived a life unbeknownst to Jesus and unbeknownst to his blessing, who at the very definition of the 11th hour, said, hey, I believe. And so, as he is escorted into heaven, they asked, how'd that guy get here? And he's like, well, the guy on the middle cross said I could come.
The grace of God. Yes, absolutely.
And so there is there's a popular sermon it's an older sermon that's floating around. I believe it's Alistair Beggs, I believe is the gentleman's name that delivered the sermon. And he talks about that very, very thing. And he talks about, everyone's surprised when the thief on the cross walks up to the pearly gates. And he said, how did you get here? You didn't study, you didn't teach, you had no profession of faith, you weren't baptized, you don't know anything about church doctrine, you don't have, any. And he said, well, the guy on the middle cross said I could come.
Right.
And that's it. Shows the boundless nature of God's grace.
And honestly, that's the same answer that all of us can give.
Yeah.
The guy on the middle
100%.
cross
Regardless
said,
of at what point in our life we came to that point. And that's one of the things, and that's something as a church family is probably a good idea to be mindful of. Of that.
Absolutely.
Just, maybe I've been here a couple of years longer than the person that's coming fresh out of the water and right through the doors, and maybe it's my time to show a little mercy and a little bit of grace while they're learning, versus stack ourselves up differently and talk about fairness when I needed every bit of the grace that was given to both of us.
Well, and I can't help but think about how somebody who's been rescued from the depths,
Oh yeah.
really just, I mean, they feel that rescue so much, sometimes so much more than someone who doesn't realize that they've been rescued the same way.
Sure,
but it's been longer. I think our brains kind of, I don't know, become accustomed to where we sit.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate.
It is, and that's a very good reminder. I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. So if we go back to our first will be last and last will be first, Jesus teaches that principle throughout his ministry and his life. And one of the times that we see that is how he shows us that to get true power, you have to step down in love and serve. And I think that's a principle that he teaches us over and over again. And that really, that gets to the heart of this message, that the first will be last and the last will be first.
Right. And you're exactly right that condition, our non-conditionary love, is shown through service. We saw it with the washing of the disciples' feet, the gathering of the children.
Yes.
Where we would go, and he always pointed out that, and it's probably a good lesson in fail-safe thinking for us.
Yeah.
That just don't just up and decide one day that you think you've got it all figured out, or you think you know how it's supposed to operate, or you've got it figured out. The same sermon that we were talking about earlier also stated, and I really like this point, that anything to do with our salvation, once we put it in the first person, we've negated it. It's wrong at that point.
Absolutely.
Once we said, "Oh, I did," or "I deserve," or "I have become," then you've absolutely obliterated it. That for the salvation, the mercy and grace of salvation exists in the third person.
Because it's all
because
Jesus.
of what he did. Then I can have anything at all.
Yes. Okay, so how do we take this principle and apply it to our lives today in today's society?
So, having younger children that live in my household, one of my go-to phrases that has become my favorite is mind your own business.
Oh, okay.
So
we use that one in my house with adult children.
With adult children.
It's okay.
So I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I am, actually saying it in the course of what I get is what I get, and what I need is what I need, and all these things are different throughout any body, and they're different within my day-to-day life. The grace that I need today may look a little bit different than the grace that you need today, but we do know that it's both needed and it's both coming from the same place. So I have no right or business in weighing myself or measuring myself against you.
So as we're looking at how to apply this to our lives today, I'm thinking about, we're just going to go right back to children's ministry because that's where I live.
That's right.
That's where we live. And every time we teach a lesson in children's ministry, what's our takeaway? What is our gospel focus? What's the theme of every lesson we teach, whether we're in the Old Testament or the New Testament?
Everything that we teach comes back to Jesus.
Jesus. Jesus saves us. Jesus is life, and he loves us. And that's, that is where we get right back to with this lesson. Jesus is life, and he saves us.
That's right.
Because it's his grace that saves each and every one of us, not just the people who have spent their entire lives serving him, but everyone who accepts him as Lord. Yeah?
Exactly.
So it goes right back to children's ministry.
So that's our take, our understanding, and our compilation on the parable of the workers in the vineyard in chapter 20 of Matthew. Would love for you to go back and take a read. Like so many of our scriptures, as you continue to read them through different stages and stations in your own life, they present different meanings and findings and things like that. And so to really have a chance to take a deep dive into a short section and just glean from it what it actually says shows that abundant grace, that necessary, life affirming and giving grace that is so freely poured out on us all has a place marked just for me.
Absolutely. And just once again to recommend both of these books. They are exceptional. Just getting a deep dive down into several of the parables. And I think my favorite thing that I'm taking away from this, I like the obscure statements or something like that. God's not fair.
God's not fair.
God is not fair.
God's not fair, and we like that.
Absolutely.
I for one, am very happy that God is not fair. That He is just, but also merciful.
So blessed that God is not fair.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us today. We hope you have enjoyed this time, and we've brought a little bit of a deeper understanding or a want to jump in here and read for yourself. And would you like me to? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and don't forget to check out the next video in our parable series.
There you go.
And you want to end us in a prayer?
Certainly, you bet.
Okay.
Father in heaven, I want to thank you for this wonderful day. I want to thank you for this forever family that I've been blessed with, and all the wonderful things they brought into my life, and the abilities that we get to do this to spread your word and your gospel and your message to as many people as possible, Lord, so that they may experience the very mercy and the very grace that has saved each and every one of us. Amen.
Amen.